Tonight, we begin with Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, and a man often remembered in bold headlines and carved into stone. But to truly understand him, and to truly slow down into his world, we must return to his very beginnings, back to a poor and rugged frontier, where life was hard, uncertain, and often lonely. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a small one-room log cabin in the wilds of Hardin County, Kentucky. The cabin itself was modest, just rough-hewn logs stacked and sealed with mud, a single door, a small window, and a dirt floor. Life here was not romantic, as some later imagined, but raw and difficult. The winters were cold, the summers sweltering, and food was never guaranteed. Families like the Lincolns had to labor endlessly just to survive. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a farmer who never found lasting success. The soil of Kentucky was often poor, and disputes over land ownership forced the family to move again and again. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was remembered as gentle and kind, but life for her was also filled with ceaseless work. Cooking over an open hearth, spinning thread, tending to children, and trying to stretch meager supplies through long seasons. For young Abraham, life was shaped not by comfort, but by scarcity. There were no luxuries, no soft edges. His childhood was marked by hunger in lean years, and by endless chores that began as soon as he was old enough to lift an axe. He split rails for fences, hauled water from streams, and walked behind a plow in fields that never seemed fertile enough. This was the American frontier of the early 19th century, and it was as unforgiving as it was wide. When Abraham was just 9 years old, tragedy struck the small household. His mother, Nancy, became sick with what was called milk sickness, an illness caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten poisonous plants. There was no cure, no doctor who could ride in to save her. She grew weaker and weaker until, one day, she was gone. For a boy already surrounded by the harshness of survival, this loss left a scar that never truly faded. His father remarried, and his stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, would become an important and loving presence in his life. She encouraged his interest in reading, and gave him the small comfort of warmth and stability in a home that had known grief. Still, the shadow of hardship remained. Lincoln grew tall and lean, his body built by labor, his hands rough and calloused long before he was grown. Education was rare and scattered. In total, Lincoln may have attended less than a year's worth of formal schooling. Instead, he taught himself. By the faint glow of a fire, or with a candle stub borrowed from a neighbor, he would open whatever book he could find. The Bible, Aesop's Fables, and a worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress shaped his earliest thoughts. Later, when he could borrow a volume of Shakespeare or a book on law, he would carefully copy passages onto wooden boards, scraps of paper, or anything that could hold writing, until the words became part of him. This boy in a log cabin, barefoot much of the time, living in a world of mud floors and hand-me-down clothing, would one day lead a nation through its darkest trial. But at this stage of his life, there was no sign of greatness, only struggle. He was not the polished gentleman of politics, but a boy who walked miles through woods to borrow a book, who grew up in silence, broken by the sound of axes and hammers, who knew the loneliness of grief and the weight of hard labor. As you drift further into this story, imagine that little cabin in the Kentucky woods. Imagine the sound of the wind slipping through the cracks in the logs, the flicker of firelight against rough-hewn walls, and a young boy bent over a borrowed book, reading slowly, word by word. That was the world of Abraham Lincoln's beginning, a simple, harsh, and unpromising start to a life that would one day shape the destiny of the United States. When we think of Abraham Lincoln, we often picture him as a tall man in a black suit, standing confidently at a podium, or seated solemnly in photographs. But long before he carried the weight of a fractured nation on his shoulders, he carried a far simpler burden. The daily struggle of survival on the American frontier. The frontier was not a romantic wilderness. It was a place where families lived with little security, where illness, hunger, and hard weather could destroy years of effort. For the Lincolns, farming was not a choice, but a necessity. If the corn grew poorly, there would be less to eat through the winter. If livestock grew sick or were lost to predators, there would be no meat or milk. Every day was measured by what work could be done, and whether that work was enough. Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, was a man who moved often in search of stability. Land disputes and poor soil forced the family to leave Kentucky for Indiana, where the promise of richer farmland seemed more hopeful. But even in Indiana, life remained harsh. To clear fields for planting, trees had to be cut, stumps pulled, and soil turned with wooden plows. Every hand was needed, and young Abraham was no exception. He grew into his strength early. Tall for his age, with long arms and a sturdy frame, he became known for his ability to wield an axe. Day after day, he split rails from logs, building fences for farms that seemed to stretch endlessly into the woods. These fences were not only practical, but symbolic, a barrier between wilderness and civilization, a mark of progress in a land that felt wild and unbroken. Neighbors who watched the young boy work would later call him the rail splitter, a nickname that followed him all the way into politics. Life on the frontier was repetitive and often joyless. There were no theaters, no libraries, no markets bustling with activity. The days were long, the nights quiet except for the sound of crickets or the distant cry of animals. Social life was limited to church gatherings, barn raisings, or the occasional visit from neighbors. For Lincoln, whose mind wandered further than the farm fields, these settings felt narrow, but they also gave him a deep familiarity with the ordinary struggles of ordinary people. The constant moving left its mark. Each time the family relocated, they had to begin again. Building a cabin, clearing land, planting crops. Security was always temporary. Nothing seemed fixed or permanent. And yet, through this unsettled life, Lincoln developed a kind of endurance that would later define him. He learned that progress was slow, that disappointment was common, and that survival meant working through exhaustion, even when the reward was uncertain. In Indiana, the hardships continued. Winters were bitter and often unforgiving. Clothing was patched and repatched, sometimes worn until it was little more than rags. Food was simple and repetitive: cornbread, bacon when it was available, and whatever vegetables could be stored through the colder months. For young Abraham, meals were not about choice or taste, but about filling an empty stomach. But while his body was occupied with labor, his mind was restless. At the end of long days, he would find moments to read or to practice writing. Neighbors told stories of seeing him stretched out on the wooden floor of his cabin, a book open in front of him, using firelight or daylight that streamed through a crack in the wall. On the back of wooden shingles or scraps of paper, he practiced letters and copied passages. This hunger for knowledge set him apart, but it was fed by the very hardships he endured. With so little comfort in daily life, books became a kind of escape. The frontier also taught Lincoln the value of community. Though families lived spread apart, they relied on one another. If a barn needed raising, neighbors gathered. If illness struck, others came to help. Lincoln saw early on that survival was not a solitary effort. It depended on cooperation, on lending a hand when others needed it most. This understanding of human interdependence would later guide his politics and his vision of a unified nation. Yet, even as Lincoln learned endurance and community, there was a darker side to frontier life. Death was common, often sudden. Disease spread easily, and medical care was almost non-existent. Children died young, mothers were lost in childbirth, and accidents in the fields or woods could be fatal. For a boy who had already lost his mother, these realities deepened his awareness of life's fragility. By the time Lincoln entered his teenage years, he was tall, thin, and awkward, with a quiet manner and a habit of thoughtful silence. His body was shaped by years of physical labor, his mind sharpened by self-study, and his heart marked by grief and hardship. The endless work, the uncertainty of survival, and the constant moving westward forged a resilience that would one day carry him through far greater trials. When we look back, it is easy to see these early years as preparation, though at the time, they must have felt like nothing more than struggle. The boy in Indiana, bent over his chores, was unknowingly training for the heavy burdens that awaited him. Every swing of the axe, every mile walked through the woods, every long evening by the firelight added to a quiet strength, the strength that would one day be tested in America's hardest years. On the frontier, schools were rare and scattered, often little more than a log cabin with a single teacher and a handful of students who came when farm work allowed. Abraham Lincoln's formal education, measured in total days, may not have added up to more than a single year. He never attended a university, never sat in lecture halls, never received the kind of polished training that many leaders of his age had. Yet, in the quiet corners of his hard life, he built his own education, slowly, steadily, and almost entirely by himself. Books were scarce, especially in rural Kentucky and Indiana, where most families had little time for anything beyond survival. But Lincoln had a hunger for knowledge that would not rest. Whenever he heard of a neighbor who owned a book, he would walk miles, sometimes barefoot, to borrow it. And when he borrowed it, he read it with a seriousness that seemed unusual for a boy of his background. At night, after long hours of labor in the fields or with the axe, he would sit by the fireplace in the cabin, or even stretch himself across the floor, using the dim glow of the flames as his only light. By firelight, he made the pages come alive. He read slowly, carefully, often aloud, turning words into sound so that they became part of his memory. His stepmother, Sarah, noticed this, and though she could not provide him with many books, she encouraged him, telling others that Abraham was different, that he wanted to learn more than anything else. The Bible was one of his earliest and most important books. Beyond its religious lessons, it gave him language, a rhythm of words, a depth of imagery, a way of speaking that carried a kind of timeless gravity. Later in life, when he gave speeches that echoed with simple power, it was often the cadence of the Bible that shaped them. Another favorite was Aesop's fables, with their short, moral stories about animals and people. From these tales, Lincoln absorbed lessons about human behavior, folly, and wisdom. He saw how simple stories could carry truths far larger than their size, and he began to understand the power of metaphor, a tool he would one day use to connect with people from every walk of life. As he grew older, his reading widened. He found a copy of Pilgrim's Progress, John Bunyan's allegory of faith and struggle, which mirrored in many ways the hardships of his own world. And when he finally encountered Shakespeare, it opened yet another door. The tragedies, the histories, the language of human ambition and failure. These were not distant plays for Lincoln, but reflections of the very struggles he saw around him. He memorized passages, recited them to himself, and carried them within him. But reading alone was not enough for Lincoln. He practiced writing, often on scraps of paper, or even on wooden boards when paper was too rare. He would copy entire passages word for word, not just to learn spelling and grammar, but to feel the shape of the sentences, to study how thoughts were built. Neighbors sometimes laughed at the sight of the tall, awkward boy scribbling on a board with a piece of charcoal, or reading aloud to himself in the fields. But he ignored their laughter. For him, these exercises were as essential as food. It was not only books that taught him. Lincoln listened closely to the people around him. In a time when storytelling was one of the few entertainments, he absorbed the tales of older men, the folklore of the frontier, the jokes and riddles traded around firesides. He learned how people spoke, how humor worked, how a story could win attention. Later, when he stood in courtrooms or on campaign stages, he would use these lessons to connect with ordinary Americans in a way that more polished politicians often could not. This self-education was not glamorous. It was slow, filled with interruptions, and carried out under the most difficult circumstances. He had to work by day and study by night. He had no mentors in the classical sense, no libraries to explore, no professors to guide him. His education was a patchwork of borrowed books, long memories, and endless determination, and yet this patchwork became the fabric of his mind. The firelight that illuminated those pages also illuminated the man Lincoln would become. From the Bible he gained moral seriousness. From Aesop he gained simplicity and clarity. From Shakespeare he gained a sense of tragedy, of the rise and fall of human ambition. Together, these influences gave him a unique voice, plain enough to reach farmers and workers, yet powerful enough to move a nation in crisis. If we imagine Lincoln in those evenings, stretched out on a rough floor, the firelight flickering the room, cold in winter and stuffy in summer, we see not a future president, but a boy with a restless mind. His body was weary from work, his clothes worn thin, but his mind refused to be contained. That mind, shaped by self-study in the harshest of conditions, would one day guide the United States through its hardest years. In the quiet of those nights, when others slept, Lincoln was building something invisible, not fences or cabins, but an inner world of knowledge, words, and ideas. That world, created by the glow of firelight in the wilderness, would one day spill outward in speeches, decisions, and actions that helped preserve a divided country. And it all began with the simple act of opening a book and refusing to stop learning. No matter how dark or difficult the world around him seemed, after those long nights of study by firelight, Lincoln's life in his late teens and early 20s was defined by labor, wandering, and a slow discovery of who he was meant to be. The world he knew was not filled with books and fine schooling, but with axes, riverboats, and shop ledgers. Yet these experiences, in their own quiet way, shaped his character as much as any classroom might have. As a young man, Lincoln became known as a rail splitter. This was not just a passing task, but one of the central labors of frontier life. With a heavy axe, he would split logs into rails, which were then used to fence farmland. It was brutal work hours of swinging, muscles aching, blisters forming across the palms. And yet, in this rhythm of chopping and splitting, Lincoln's tall frame and unmatched strength became his reputation. Neighbors remembered him not just as a hard worker, but as someone who could outlast nearly anyone in the field. But Lincoln's ambitions would not be fenced in by farm labor alone. In his early 20s, he joined flatboat crews that journeyed down the Mississippi River, carrying goods to New Orleans. These river voyages exposed him to a broader world far removed from the cornfields of Indiana. For the first time, Lincoln encountered the bustling ports, the sounds of commerce, the hum of cities, and, most importantly, the human realities of slavery on southern plantations. These impressions would not leave him. They lingered quietly, shaping convictions that would one day define his presidency. Returning north, Lincoln tried his hand as a store clerk in New Salem, Illinois. Here he developed not just practical skills with numbers and ledgers, but a gift for connecting with people. Customers remembered his honesty so much so that when he accidentally overcharged someone by a few pennies, he would walk miles to return the money. In a world where hard survival sometimes demanded cutting corners, Lincoln's sense of fairness and integrity stood out. Through these years of work and wandering, Lincoln was slowly crafting his identity. He was not yet the polished lawyer or the politician, but the foundation was being built in sweat, effort, and an understanding of ordinary people. From rail fences to riverboats, from shop counters to evenings of debate with local men, he absorbed the struggles, hopes, and frustrations of frontier America. It was in this mixture of labor and learning, of moving from place to place, that Abraham Lincoln grew into a figure who could stand between worlds, a man of the soil, but also a man of words. Someone who understood toil, but who dreamed of something greater. By his early 20s, Abraham Lincoln had tasted the steady rhythm of farm labor, the restless pull of river journeys, and the hum of life behind the counter of a small store. But deep within, he carried a quiet urge to take part in something larger than himself. The small community of New Salem, Illinois, where he had settled, became the unlikely stage for his first steps into politics. In 1832, at the age of 23, Lincoln announced his candidacy for the Illinois state legislature. It was a bold move for a man of such limited formal education and modest means. He had no powerful family connections, no fortune to lean on. What he carried instead was a gift for plain speech, an easy manner with neighbors, and a reputation for honesty and hard work. These were not small things on the frontier, where character often mattered more than polish. Yet, his first attempt was marked by awkwardness and defeat. Lincoln had not yet mastered the art of public speaking. His tall, lanky frame, his high-pitched voice, and his rural appearance made him stand out in ways that were not always flattering. He struggled to make himself heard in noisy gatherings and had to fight off self-doubt when more experienced men dismissed him as unpolished. That first campaign ended in failure. Lincoln lost, placing far behind the more established candidates. But the story did not end there. What defined Lincoln, even in those early days, was not immediate success but stubborn persistence. He did not retreat into bitterness or self-pity. Instead, he redoubled his efforts to study law, to sharpen his wit, and to learn from the people around him. He worked long hours improving his ability to tell stories and to debate. Slowly, the awkwardness began to soften into a style that was uniquely his, plain, direct, and honest, but also laced with humor and human warmth. By 1834, Lincoln tried again, and this time he won. His election to the Illinois legislature marked the first real step in a public career that would carry him over decades, from the rough floorboards of the State House in Vandalia to the White House in Washington. In that victory, small as it may have seemed, Lincoln found the proof that perseverance, even after embarrassment and failure, could bear fruit. Looking back, it is easy to see greatness forming in those years. But in the moment, Lincoln was still just a young man in a small western town, ambitious, uncertain, often awkward yet unwilling to give up. The seeds of leadership were planted not in triumph, but in the soil of persistence and humility. After finding his footing in politics, Abraham Lincoln turned more fully toward the law, a profession that seemed to fit both his restless mind and his ability to connect with ordinary people. Yet, being a lawyer on the mid-19th century Illinois frontier was nothing like the grand courtrooms and polished chambers we imagine today. It was a life of constant travel, sparse accommodations, and the quiet companionship of long miles on horseback. Lincoln joined what was known as the 8th Judicial Circuit, a wide circuit of rural counties where judges and lawyers traveled together to hold court in small towns. For months out of the year, Lincoln rode from one county seat to another, carrying only what he needed in saddlebags, clothes, papers, and a few books. The journeys could stretch over rough prairie paths, across swollen rivers, and through long stretches of open land where only the wind and birds kept company. Nights were spent in simple taverns or the spare rooms of farmhouses, where food was plain cornbread, beans, salt pork, and beds were often shared with other travelers. Despite the hardships, Lincoln thrived in this setting. His reputation for fairness and honesty spread quickly. He was not a lawyer who sought to twist facts or mislead juries. Instead, he relied on plain reasoning and a gift for language that made complicated matters simple to ordinary ears. His arguments were persuasive not because they were ornate, but because they were grounded in common sense. People came to trust him not just as an advocate in court, but as a man who carried integrity wherever he went. What also set Lincoln apart was his humor and storytelling. On the long rides between towns, evenings in crowded taverns, or while waiting for court to open, Lincoln would spin tales that had his companions laughing until their sides ached. He drew from fables, frontier anecdotes, and the quirks of human nature he observed so carefully. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were tools he used later in court and in politics to make his points memorable. The prairie circuit taught Lincoln more than the law. It deepened his understanding of people, their worries, their values, their contradictions. He met farmers burdened with debts, merchants struggling to keep accounts, widows trying to protect small inheritances. He listened, advised, and argued on their behalf. These years, traveling endlessly across Illinois, polished Lincoln into more than a local politician. They shaped him into a man who could see the struggles of ordinary people with empathy and translate them into clear, persuasive words. By the time he gained recognition as one of the most respected lawyers on the circuit, Lincoln had built more than a career. He had built a reputation as Honest Abe, the lawyer who would rather lose a case than win by unfair means. That reputation would follow him all the way into national politics, where trust and character would prove more valuable than gold. Romance, for Abraham Lincoln, was never simple. His early years in New Salem and Springfield brought moments of deep affection and heartbreak that seemed to weigh as heavily on him as any political burden. In his youth, Lincoln formed a tender bond with Anne Rutledge, the daughter of a tavern keeper. Their relationship was marked by gentle companionship, but it ended in tragedy when Anne died young, likely of typhoid fever, in 1835. Lincoln was devastated. Friends recalled him wandering the fields, overcome with grief, and speaking of her with a quiet sorrow that never entirely left him. That loss became a shadow in his memory, a reminder of how fragile happiness could be on the harsh frontier. In the years that followed, Lincoln's personal life reflected his awkwardness and melancholy. He was intelligent and witty in company, yet hesitant in matters of love. He entered into courtships that faltered, sometimes because of his own doubts, sometimes because of circumstances. Letters reveal a man who analyzed his emotions with the same careful logic he applied to law, weighing the risks of marriage as though it were a legal contract. It was in Springfield, however, that Lincoln met Mary Todd, a spirited young woman from a prominent Kentucky family. Mary was sharp, ambitious, and well-educated, qualities that both attracted and challenged Lincoln. She believed in his potential long before others did, convinced he was destined for greatness. Their relationship was passionate but turbulent. They quarreled fiercely, broke off an engagement, then reconciled and married in 1842. Their marriage was never an easy one. Mary had a fiery temper and high expectations, while Lincoln was often withdrawn, sinking into periods of melancholy. Yet, beneath the storminess, there was also affection, respect, and a shared belief in Lincoln's rising destiny. Together they built a household in Springfield, raising 4 sons, Robert, Edward, Willie, and Tad. Tragedy, however, struck their family again and again. Edward died in childhood, and later, during Lincoln's presidency, their beloved son Willie succumbed to illness in the White House. These losses cut deeply into both parents. Lincoln bore them with quiet sorrow, while Mary's grief overwhelmed her, leaving scars on her spirit that would last the rest of her life. Their marriage, with its joys and storms, mirrored Lincoln's own journey, a blend of resilience, sorrow, and perseverance. Though marked by conflict, their union grounded him. Mary's belief in him, however difficult their life together became, was part of the foundation that carried him from the prairies of Illinois to the presidency of the United States. To understand Abraham Lincoln's rise, one must first pause and picture the America of the 1830s and 1840s, the world in which he lived and worked. It was a nation full of contradictions, expanding and hopeful on one hand, deeply divided and restless on the other. In the north, towns were growing into bustling cities, Factories clattered with the sound of machinery, canals and railroads stretched across the landscape, and free labor, the idea that a man could work hard, save money, and climb the ladder of opportunity was celebrated as a cornerstone of American life. Immigrants from Ireland and Germany poured into these regions, swelling populations and adding to both cultural richness and social tension. Daily life for many was a mixture of long work hours, cramped living conditions, and the simple comforts of church, family, and community gatherings. In the South, the reality was starkly different. The economy was built on vast plantations and the labor of enslaved people. Cotton was king, and with it came immense wealth for planters, but misery and bondage for millions of African Americans. The culture of honor, hierarchy, and tradition ran deep, and slavery was defended not only as an economic necessity, but, by many, as a way of life ordained to continue. The West, where Lincoln himself came of age, was still a frontier. Small farms dotted the countryside, cabins stood isolated along rivers and prairies, and life was defined by communities were tight-knit but scattered, and people depended on neighbors as much as they distrusted distant governments. Roads were rough, mail was slow, and travel meant days of horseback riding or wagon journeys. Yet beneath these everyday realities was a growing national tension. The question of slavery's expansion into new territories, the balance of power between free and slave states, and the moral arguments rising from abolitionists in the North created constant friction. Newspapers buzzed with fiery editorials, churches debated scripture on slavery, and families themselves could be divided over what the future of the nation should look like. For the average American in Lincoln's time, life meant hard work, uncertain futures, and constant change. Farmers worried about markets for their crops. Factory workers fretted over wages and conditions. Enslaved men and women endured lives of forced labor and constant fear, while reformers raised their voices, hoping to awaken the conscience of the nation. This was the America Lincoln lived in, a place of hope and hardship, expansion and division, freedom and bondage. It was within this restless and conflicted society that Lincoln began to sharpen his own views, guided by his experiences as a working man, a lawyer, and a politician who sensed that the nation's greatest struggles still lay ahead. For much of Abraham Lincoln's early life, slavery was a distant reality, something he encountered not every day but often enough to leave a lasting impression. As a young man floating down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, he had seen enslaved people chained together at auction, treated as mere property. The image stayed with him, though at first it stirred quiet unease more than fiery abolitionism. Lincoln's early political career reflected this cautious stance. As a member of the Whig Party, he believed deeply in the promise of free labor, of men working, saving, and rising in society through determination and skill. Slavery, to him, seemed to contradict this vision. It froze human beings into permanent bondage and denied the dignity of self-improvement that Lincoln himself cherished. Yet, like many moderate Northerners, he stopped short of calling for its immediate abolition where it already existed. He worried about the Constitution, about the fragile balance between North and South, and about what drastic change might do to the young nation. His language in the 1830s and 1840s was careful, measured, even hesitant. When he did speak against slavery, he framed his words within law and morality. In one of his early public statements, he described slavery as a monstrous injustice, but he also admitted that he did not see an easy way to end it peacefully. To Lincoln, slavery was wrong, yet the path forward was cloudy. Still, hints of the future crisis appeared in his speeches. He praised the principles of the Declaration of Independence, insisting that all men are created equal must hold true across time and circumstance. He worried aloud about slavery's expansion into new territories, sensing that it could tear apart the Union, though he lacked the radical fire of abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison or Frederick Douglass. Lincoln's words carried a quiet conviction. The nation could not forever endure half slave and half free. His views developed slowly, shaped not by sudden revelation but by steady reflection. As a lawyer, he believed in the power of the law to order society. As a man of moral instinct, he believed no human being should be treated as property. These two beliefs, law and morality, sometimes pulled against each other, but over time, they drew him steadily toward the conclusion that slavery was incompatible with the ideals of the Republic. By the time Lincoln entered the national stage, his voice was still measured, but the moral undercurrents were unmistakable. He was becoming not only a politician of compromise, but also a leader whose conscience was beginning to point toward the great reckoning that would define his life and his nation. The 1850s were years of deepening tension in America, years when the old compromises that had once kept the nation together began to fray. It was in this atmosphere that Abraham Lincoln, after years of quiet legal work in Springfield, stepped back into politics. At first glance, his re-entry seemed modest, even hesitant, yet within a few short years, he would become a name recognized across the country, his words echoing far beyond Illinois. At the heart of his rise was the question of slavery's expansion. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, championed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, struck Lincoln like a thunderclap. The act allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, overturning earlier compromises that had limited its spread. To many Northerners, including Lincoln, this was not simply a legal adjustment but a dangerous opening of old wounds. He began speaking out, often in town halls and modest gatherings, warning that slavery could not be allowed to march unchecked across the West. Lincoln's voice carried a peculiar force. He was not polished like some orators, nor fiery like abolitionists, but his speeches had a clarity that drew people in. He would take a complicated issue and unravel it patiently, step by step, until the logic became undeniable. Listeners often remarked that he seemed less like a politician and more like a neighbor explaining hard truths by the fireside. His greatest stage came in the debates with Stephen Douglas during the Illinois Senate race of 1858. 7 times, in towns scattered across the state, the two men faced each other before vast crowds. Douglas argued that popular sovereignty, the right of territories to choose slavery or not, was the fair solution. Lincoln countered that a nation founded on liberty could not endure with such moral contradictions. A house divided against itself cannot stand, he declared in one of his most famous lines. Though Lincoln ultimately lost the Senate race, the debates catapulted him to national attention. Newspapers across the country reprinted his words. His calm but firm opposition to slavery's expansion appealed to many who feared both Southern extremism and Northern radicalism. To them, Lincoln seemed a middle ground, principled but steady, moral but not reckless. By the decade's end, as the conflict between North and South grew sharper, Lincoln's path to Washington was becoming clear. The lawyer from Illinois, once little known outside his home state, was now seen as a man capable of guiding the nation through its gathering storm. What had begun with quiet speeches in small towns was slowly drawing him toward the highest office in the land, and toward a destiny he could not yet fully see. The election of 1860 unfolded in an atmosphere heavy with fear and mistrust. The United States had grown more divided with each passing year. The quarrel over slavery no longer confined to courtrooms and speeches, but spilling into violence in Kansas and bitter fights in Congress. Into this fractured stage stepped Abraham Lincoln, a man little known beyond Illinois only a few years earlier, now carrying the banner of the young Republican Party. The Republicans were not abolitionists in the fiery sense, but they were firm in one conviction: slavery must not be allowed to spread into the Western territories. For many in the South, that stance alone was unacceptable, for they believed it threatened their very way of life. Lincoln, with his measured speeches and plain-spoken logic, became the candidate who embodied this new firmness. The election fractured along regional lines. The Democratic Party split in two, Stephen Douglas carrying the North. John C. Breckinridge favored in the South, while a fourth candidate, John Bell, appealed for compromise and unity. Rarely had Americans seen a ballot so divided. Lincoln campaigned quietly, staying in Springfield, while surrogates and newspapers carried his message outward. When the votes were counted in November, the result stunned many. Lincoln had won the presidency with strong support across the North, but almost no backing from the South. His name had not even appeared on many Southern ballots, yet he had secured enough electoral votes to prevail. To his supporters, it was a victory for principle and a sign that the nation's future could be steered away from slavery's expansion. To his opponents, especially in the Deep South, it was nothing less than a calamity. The news of Lincoln's victory was met not with acceptance but with outrage. In town squares and state houses, Southern leaders warned that their rights were under attack, their future endangered. Some spoke openly of secession before Lincoln had even taken office. And so, while Lincoln remained in Springfield, quietly preparing for the burdens ahead, the storm clouds gathered. His election, peaceful in its ballots, had touched off a reaction that would soon plunge the country into its greatest conflict. The rail splitter from Illinois had reached the highest office, but he would enter it facing a nation already breaking apart. As the news of Lincoln's election spread across the nation in late 1860, the Union began to tremble. For decades, Threats of disunion had been uttered whenever compromise failed, but now they took on a sharper, more immediate form. In December, before Lincoln could even leave Springfield, South Carolina declared its secession from the United States. Within weeks, other states of the Deep South followed, as though one falling domino pushed the next. From his modest home in Illinois, Lincoln watched these events unfold with a mixture of concern and silence. He had not yet taken office. He had no official power to act, yet he understood the weight of what was happening. Letters flooded him, pleas for reassurance, demands for clarity, questions about whether the Union could be saved. He responded cautiously, choosing words that sought to calm rather than inflame. Publicly, he reminded Americans that the Union was perpetual, bound by law and by history. Privately, he worried deeply, knowing that whatever decisions he made after March 4, 1861, would shape the nation's fate. The country itself seemed to hang in suspension. In Washington, President James Buchanan, nearing the end of his term, hesitated, unwilling to take strong measures to confront secession. Federal forts in the South stood isolated and vulnerable, their small garrisons symbols of a government suddenly weakened. Meanwhile, conventions in the seceded states organized, debated, and formally withdrew, forming a new government they called the Confederacy. Lincoln's days in Springfield were heavy with preparation. He spent hours reading, drafting notes, and conferring with close allies. Visitors described him as calm, yet thoughtful, almost grave. Though friends urged him to offer bold promises to soothe the South, he refused to abandon the central principle that had guided his rise. Slavery must not expand. It was not an easy stance. He knew it meant confrontation might come, but to yield would mean surrendering everything the Republican Party and his own conscience stood for. In those long winter months, the Union itself felt fragile, as though a single misstep might shatter it beyond repair. And in Springfield, Lincoln carried the burden of knowing that soon all eyes would turn to him, not just to lead, but to preserve a nation already unraveling. The long winter of uncertainty came to an end in the spring of 1861. By then, 7 Southern states had left the Union, and they now claimed to be an independent confederacy. Yet, one question lingered. Would the division remain only on paper, or would it ignite into war? The answer came in Charleston Harbor, where a small island fortress named Fort Sumter became the flashpoint. Inside the fort, a modest garrison of U.S. soldiers held their ground, short of supplies, surrounded by Confederate forces who demanded their surrender. Lincoln faced his first great test as president. To abandon the fort would mean conceding legitimacy to secession. To forcefully defend it risked open war. After long consideration, Lincoln chose a middle path. He would send only food, not weapons, to the soldiers. His message was clear: he would not provoke bloodshed, but neither would he yield the Union's authority. The response came swiftly. In the early hours of April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter. For 34 hours shells rained down on the small garrison until, battered and overwhelmed, the Union troops surrendered. No lives were lost in the bombardment, yet the echo of those guns carried across the nation. War had begun. News spread rapidly, printed in bold headlines, whispered in towns, carried along telegraph wires that stitched the country together. In the North, outrage surged. Men rushed to volunteer, and crowds filled city squares pledging loyalty to the flag. In the South, the shots were celebrated as the birth of their new nation, a proof of independence secured by force. For Lincoln, the burden deepened. He had hoped for peace, yet now he faced the full weight of civil war. On April 15 he called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. In doing so, he drew more states: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee into the Confederacy. The Union he had sworn to preserve was now fractured beyond imagining. And so, with the smoke of Fort Sumter still lingering over Charleston Harbor, America entered a conflict unlike any it had ever faced. A war of brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor, a nation divided against itself. When people think of the Civil War, they often imagine booming cannons, waving flags, and the clash of armies on open fields. Yet for most of those who lived through it, war was not a moment of grand heroism, but a long, grinding daily reality. Life unfolded not only on the battlefront, but also in muddy camps, in weary households, and in the small routines of survival. For the common soldier, war meant endless days of waiting. Camps sprang up across the countryside, rows of canvas tents pitched on wet ground. Rain turned dirt roads into rivers of mud, and men slept wrapped in thin blankets, their boots often soaked, their uniforms stiff with dust or damp with sweat. Food was simple, and often poor. hardtack biscuits as hard as wood, salt pork that spoiled in the heat, beans boiled in blackened pots. Dysentery, fever, and infection claimed more lives than bullets, and soldiers often fought boredom, loneliness, and illness long before facing enemy fire. Letters were the lifeline between home and camp. Soldiers wrote on scraps of paper by lantern light, describing the weather, the meals, and their aching homesickness. Families waited anxiously for the arrival of the post rider, scanning each envelope for news. Sometimes the letters came stained with dirt or rain. Sometimes they stopped coming altogether. On the home front, life shifted under the weight of absence. Farms were tilled by women and children, who shouldered the work of men gone to war. Towns endured shortages of flour, sugar, cloth, and salt as blockades tightened and inflation rose. Clothing was patched again and again, and meals were stretched with substitutes and ingenuity. In both North and South, grief settled like a shadow as news of casualties spread. Black mourning dresses became a common sight, and entire communities seemed draped in sorrow. For enslaved people in the South, the war meant uncertainty and a glimmer of hope. Some were forced to labor for the Confederate Army, building fortifications or tending to fields in the absence of their enslaved. Others fled when Union troops drew near, risking everything for a chance at freedom. Their journeys added another layer of human struggle to a war that reshaped every life it touched. So much of the Civil War was lived not in the roar of battle, but in the slow toll of ordinary days: muddy boots, empty kitchens, tear-stained letters, and prayers whispered at night. These quieter moments reveal a truth often forgotten. War is not only fought with guns and flags, but born in the hearts of those who wait, endure, and hope. As the war dragged on, Abraham Lincoln's days and nights became an endless cycle of burdens. From his office in the White House, he managed a conflict that stretched across thousands of miles, commanded armies that often resisted his direction, and presided over a nation bitterly divided. His desk was buried beneath stacks of letters, petitions from soldiers' families, pleas from widows, demands from generals, and sharp criticisms from political rivals. He read them all, often late into the night, with a weary candle burning beside him. The generals posed their own challenges. Some hesitated, moving too slowly or losing chances on the battlefield. Lincoln, though lacking formal military training, studied strategy, read reports, and pushed his commanders to act decisively. He wrote to them with firm but measured words, sometimes visiting the front himself, walking through muddy camps to encourage the men and to remind the generals that the war could not be fought from the safety of Washington alone. Politics pressed on him constantly. He faced radical Republicans urging him toward abolition and swift, uncompromising action, while Democrats accused him of tyranny and overreach. Every decision risked angering one side or the other. Through it all, Lincoln remained calm in public. His tall frame stooped, but his voice steady. Even when inside he carried the weight of doubt. At home, grief visited him again and again. The White House, though a seat of power, was also a place of sorrow. In 1862, his beloved son Willie died at only 11 years old, a loss that shattered both Abraham and Mary Lincoln. In the midst of war, they mourned as parents, retreating into private anguish even as the nation demanded their strength. Lincoln's nights often ended with solitude. Long after others had gone to sleep, he sat alone, reading dispatches or pondering his choices. The weight of command was not just in the orders he gave, but in the faces of the men who would carry them out and in the families who would bear the consequences. He was, in every sense, a war president, a leader stretched between military strategy, political storms, and personal tragedy, holding the Union together while carrying his own quiet sorrow. Through the first year of the war, Abraham Lincoln carried a question that weighed on his conscience and his strategy alike. What role should slavery play in this conflict? He had always opposed its expansion, yet as president, he moved cautiously. Many loyal slaveholding states still clung to the Union, and Lincoln feared that an open strike against slavery too soon might push them into the Confederacy's arms. At the same time, abolitionists pressed him to act, and enslaved men and women were already seizing their own freedom, fleeing plantations and seeking refuge with Union armies. The war was making slavery untenable. Whether Lincoln spoke the words or not, his hesitation was not indifference but calculation. Lincoln believed that, to preserve the Union, he needed broad support, and timing mattered. He waited for a Union victory, fearing that, if emancipation were declared in the midst of defeat, it would appear desperate rather than decisive. That moment came after the bloody struggle at Antietam in September 1862, though not a clear triumph. It was enough for Lincoln to issue his preliminary proclamation. Unless the rebelling states laid down their arms, slavery in those states would be declared forever abolished. On January 1st, 1863, he made good on that promise. The final Emancipation Proclamation declared freedom for enslaved people in all areas still in rebellion. It did not end slavery everywhere. Border states loyal to the Union remained untouched, but it transformed the very meaning of the war. No longer was the struggle only about restoring the Union, it was about freedom, about a nation finally confronting its original sin. The proclamation carried immense weight abroad as well. In Europe, where sympathy for the Confederacy had existed, the war was now undeniably linked to the cause of ending slavery. Support for intervention on behalf of the South diminished. At home, the decision inspired many, while others resisted bitterly. For Lincoln, the act was both practical and moral. He later said that if he could save the Union without freeing a single slave, he would have done it. But by 1863, he understood that the Union could not be truly saved without striking at the institution that had divided it. The words he signed that cold January day echoed far beyond the parchment. They gave new purpose to the war, enlisted formerly enslaved men into the Union ranks, and shifted history's course. Lincoln, in his measured, deliberate way, had redefined not only his presidency but the destiny of the nation. By the middle years of the Civil War, the great early cries of patriotism had dulled into something quieter, more burdened, and more difficult to endure. The war, which so many on both sides had once believed might be decided quickly, dragged on into long winters of mud, disease, and scarcity. Camps filled with soldiers who rarely saw battle but often suffered through boredom, hunger, and sickness. Pneumonia, dysentery, and fever claimed more lives than bullets, and the stench of illness lingered as heavily as the smoke of cannon fire. For families at home, the weight was no lighter. Mothers waited for letters that might never arrive, and when they did, they were often filled with exhaustion rather than hope. Widows struggled to feed children with husbands gone, farms untended, and prices for food climbing ever higher. The initial rush of volunteers had slowed, and desertions became more common. Some soldiers slipped away under cover of darkness, unable to bear another month of endless marching and half rations. Others stayed but carried resentment, wondering if the cause was worth such suffering. Abraham Lincoln, at the center of it all, bore his own crushing strain. Every morning brought a new pile of letters to his desk, requests for pardons, reports of failures, petitions for relief, and the endless paperwork of war. His generals quarreled with each other, politicians in Congress criticized his every move, and the press painted him alternately as a tyrant and a weakling. Through it all, he sat in the dim light of his office, often working late into the night, his face drawn, his frame thinner. The war tested his endurance as much as any battle tested the army's. He suffered from sleepless nights, from grief that never left him after the death of his young son Willie, and from the loneliness of command. Yet somehow he endured. He had little choice but to endure. The fate of the Union, battered and weary though it was, depended on his quiet, persistent strength. For the soldiers in their tents, for the families in their darkened homes, and for the president in his candlelit office, the war had become not a grand cause or a quick crusade, but a grinding test of patience, resolve, and the human spirit's ability to hold on when everything seemed bleak. The summer of 1863 brought the war to a small Pennsylvania town whose name would be etched forever in history, Gettysburg. What began as a chance encounter between Confederate and Union forces swelled into 3 days of desperate fighting across rolling fields, ridges, and stone walls. By the end, tens of thousands of men lay dead or wounded, the hills and meadows transformed into a silent graveyard. For the Confederacy, it marked a halt to their bold push north. For the Union, it became a turning point, proof that, though battered, the Republic could still endure. In the weeks that followed, the town of Gettysburg struggled under the weight of so many dead. Farmers plowed their fields with the stench of battle still in the air. Families in distant states received letters that shattered them one after another. And yet, amid the grief, there was also a sense that something had shifted. The war no longer seemed like a distant contest of armies. It was now understood as a fight over the very meaning of the nation. When Abraham Lincoln journeyed to Gettysburg in November to dedicate a cemetery for the fallen, expectations were modest. The main orator of the day, Edward Everett, spoke for 2 hours with polished rhetoric. Lincoln, by contrast, stood quietly, adjusted his spectacles, and spoke for barely 2 minutes. His words were spare, but they carried the weight of all the years of struggle, that the Union must live, that democracy itself was on trial, and that those who had died must not have done so in vain. The crowd was hushed. Many did not realize, in that moment, how timeless the address would become. But Lincoln had spoken with the calm of a man who had looked death in the face, who knew the cost of war more intimately than most. His speech did not glorify the struggle. Instead, it reminded a weary nation of purpose that beyond the endless marching, the grief, and the division, there was still something worth holding together. Gettysburg was not the end of the war. More blood would be spilled, more fields would be scarred. But from that place, from those few words, the path forward took on a clearer meaning. The conflict was no longer just about preserving the Union, it was about redefining freedom, and ensuring that the nation, born of equality, might truly live up to its promise. By the spring of 1865, the long war was nearing its end. The Union armies, under generals like Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, pressed forward with relentless determination. Sherman's march through the South had cut deep into Confederate strength, leaving farms and railroads broken, morale shattered. In Virginia, Grant's slow, grinding campaign pinned Robert E. Lee's exhausted army until there was little left to give. For soldiers on both sides, the final months were a haze of mud, hunger, and fatigue. Beneath it all was the dawning realization that the conflict was drawing to a close. When Lee finally surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, it was not with the thunder of cannons, but with the quiet formality of two generals meeting in a parlor. Lee appeared in his finest uniform, Grant in a simple mud-stained coat. The terms were generous. Confederate soldiers would be allowed to return home with their horses, to rebuild their lives. There was no triumphal gloating, no parade of humiliation. The war had been too terrible, its cost too heavy, for anything but solemn relief. For Abraham Lincoln, the end of the war was not a moment of victory, but of possibility. He spoke of reconciliation, of binding up the nation's wounds, of moving past bitterness to rebuild. To those around him, he seemed almost lightened, as though the burden he had carried for 4 long years was beginning to lift. At his second inaugural address, just weeks before, he had spoken words that struck a different tone than celebration. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he had said, calling not for vengeance, but for healing. And yet, fate was cruel. On the evening of April 14th, just days after Appomattox, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. It was meant to be a rare moment of rest, a small taste of ordinary joy. But in the dim light of the theater, an assassin's bullet ended his life, striking down the man who had carried the nation through its darkest trial. The news spread quickly, shattering the fragile sense of relief that had come with victory. Across the North, bells tolled and crowds wept openly in the streets. In the South, even among those who had opposed him, there was a sense of shock. The war had taken countless lives, but in Lincoln's death, the nation lost the steady hand that might have guided it into peace. His body was carried by train back to Illinois, through towns draped in mourning black, past fields still scarred by conflict. Ordinary Americans gathered by the tracks, waiting hours for the chance to glimpse the funeral train, to stand silently as it passed. For them, Lincoln was not simply a president. He was a symbol of endurance, of quiet strength, of a nation's survival against despair. The war had ended, but in its final days, the price had grown even higher. Victory came with sorrow, and the task of rebuilding a divided country was left unfinished in Lincoln's absence. As we reach the quiet conclusion of Lincoln's story, the noise of battle, the clamor of politics, and the grief of a divided land slowly fade into memory. What lingers instead is the figure of a man who, against all odds, endured. Abraham Lincoln did not lead with brilliance and strategy, nor with charisma that dazzled, but with a kind of patient, steady humanity that guided a fractured nation through its darkest passage. He carried not only the weight of the Union, but also the burdens of personal sorrow, losing children, living with constant criticism, and knowing that each decision meant more lives would be lost. Yet through all of it, he never surrendered to despair. His endurance was quiet, almost unremarkable in its appearance, but it was unshakable. It was this humanity, his empathy for soldiers in muddy camps, for widows waiting at home, for slaves yearning for freedom, that gave his leadership its strength. He reminded the nation that beyond armies and governments were people, and it was for them that the Union must survive. Though his life was cut short at the very moment of victory, Lincoln's presence seems eternal. His words, brief yet powerful, continue to echo, appeals for unity, for charity, for malice toward none and kindness toward all. In them, we hear the voice of someone who believed that even through unimaginable suffering, hope could endure. So as you prepare to rest, imagine Lincoln not as the marble figure on a monument, but as the weary man in his office late at night. A single lamp burns, papers lie scattered, and outside the window the nation trembles in uncertainty. Yet at his desk he remains calm, pen in hand, shoulders slightly bent, carrying the burden because he must. And in that image, there is a lesson for us, that in the hardest years, it is not brilliance or grandeur that carries us through, but quiet, persistence, empathy, and the strength to endure one day at a time. With that thought, let the story of Lincoln's life gently close, like the last pages of a book turning softly in the night. May his endurance, his sorrow, and his humanity settle over you like a blanket, guiding you into rest, into stillness, into sleep.